A very good morning to everyone, a very big welcome to everyone who is joining us here on Eastern Time or wherever in the globe that you may be, to this event organized by the WCED Center for Emerging Democracies. My name is Hanisah Sani, and I am an overseas postdoctoral fellow with the National University of Singapore and also a visiting associate at the WCED. I am a sociologist and I study the historical process of state formation, focusing on the legacies of state development, especially on legal and religious institutions in Southeast Asia. At WCED, we are very happy to start the academic year with a series of panel discussions on the state of democracy and autocracy across the world, a topic that is all the more urgent at this current moment than any in recent history. We started off with our Flashpoint series on Belarus 2 weeks ago, and we meet again today to discuss the situation with democracy in the Muslim world. This panel is a lead up to a special issue of the upcoming Democracy and Autocracy newsletter of the American Political Science Association on the same topic that I'll be guest co-editing with Pauline Jones, Professor of Political Science and Director of International Institute here at the UM. Professor Jones specializes in development and institutions and is an expert herself on majority Muslim countries in Central Asia. I am very happy to have our panel reconvene because we had originally meant to meet up in person in March, but it was canceled because of COVID. And so I'm delighted that we get to be able to come together again here today to have this conversation, albeit online, for members of our community and also for members of the interested public. And so without further ado, I'm happy to present an impressive group of scholars who are currently joining us from across the globe and whose work span the geographic regions of the Muslim world. We have with us today Jaimie Bleck, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. She specializes in African politics with a focus on democratization, education, and citizenship. Mark Tessler, who is Samuel J. Eldersveld Collegiate Professor of Political Science here at the University of Michigan. He specializes in comparative politics and the Middle East. Next, we have Şebnem Yardımcı-Geyikçi, who is joining us today from Istanbul. She is an assistant professor of politics at Hacettepe University, and she studies party development in new democracies, focusing on Turkey and Southern Europe. She was also a visiting associate with us last year, so we welcome her back to WCED. Last and certainly not least, we have with us joining from furthest away in Sydney, Australia, is Zubaidah Rahim, who is Professor of Global Studies at Monash University's Malaysia campus and Honorary Fellow at the Al-Walid Center for Christian Muslim Understanding at Georgetown University, and Professor Rahim specializes in authoritarian governance and Southeast Asian politics. So the logistics of the panel, each speaker will have 15 minutes on the clock, and then we will open up it to question and answer. For the audience among us, if you look at the bottom panel on your Zoom window, you will see a Q&A button. So simply press that button to submit your questions at any time during the event. If you could preface your question with a brief note of introduction of yourself, that will be really great, but not required. A note for those who may need a live transcript to help you follow the audio and video sources, that you indicate your request alongside your question, and our technical team working hard behind the scenes will try their very best to provide this for you. So yeah, that's it. Okay, so now let me first invite Professor Bleck for her first presentation.
First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, thank my fellow co-panelists, and definitely a big thanks to Derek and Hanisah for putting together all the behind the scenes work. And I also want to wish you all a happy Malian Independence Day. It's September 22nd. Yeah, so today I'm going to speak to you a bit about Mali, some of the things that you might have heard in the news, including the recent coup and a growing jihadist incursion in much of the center and north of the country. But also really my point of emphasis is to talk a bit about the context of multi-partyism in Mali, give you a bit of background. And I want to analyze two factors that I think characterize Mali's experience with multi-party elections. So one is what I'll refer to in a second as uneven pluralism, and the second, state weakness, and trying to understand how those two factors limit or create sort of democratic frailty in the spirit of this panel. And then finally, I thought I'd shift and spend some time talking about the role of religion in politics in Mali, and I'll conclude with a little bit of original research from some focus groups that I've been doing on what the role of religion and politics should be. I'm a scholar of citizen attitudes and behavior, so I'm going to draw quite a bit on my work talking to people in different parts of Mali as I go through this presentation. Great. So here's a picture of the Mud Mosque in Djenné. It's a World Heritage Site. For those of you who aren't familiar with the beautiful Malian architecture, I wanted to share this image with you. Mali is a large landlocked country in West Africa. It's about 2.2 times the size of France. It's roughly 95% Muslim with an incredible ethnic diversity. There's a very rich political heritage from the pre-colonial period, so dating back to 1235. Some scholars describe the Kurukan as the first human rights, one of the first human rights charters in the world. And there's a conflict mitigation mechanism of cousinage stemming from statements in that period that still persists hundreds of years later, and you can still detect in current interactions in Malian society. There's a famous article by Dunning and Harrison that shows its influence in the current political sphere. Mali transitioned to multi-party democracy in 1991 after a coup, and between the period of 1992 and roughly 2012, had experienced 4 presidential and legislative elections, 2 alternations of power. One of those alternations going back to a former coup leader had sat down and then presented himself as the president later on. And so I wanted to sort of set the stage as we then shift to the current period of what we call the Malian crisis. And so just last month, Mali had another coup, and it's the government is currently in negotiation for, the junta is working to create a transitional government that will work for 18 months before there will be a new round of elections. And so this coup was very much in response to popular dissatisfaction with the incumbents' mismanagement of the crisis. So not unlike the coup in 2012, we see public opinion sort of largely in favor, at least in Bamako, of the junta stepping in to resolve sort of a crisis in the country. I'm going to talk a lot today about center and periphery. And so it's important to note that this coup is happening in the capital of Bamako. But this crisis of insecurity has really been plaguing Mali all the way back to 2012. There was a French intervention in 2013 to push back many of the insurgent and jihadist groups. And since then, there's been a peace agreement, 2 rounds of elections, which the incumbent who was just pulled out of power, he won both of those elections. But if you talk to sort of everyday people, especially those living outside of the capital, they would say that their lives have grown sort of more financially insecure and facing sort of increasing security challenges throughout the country. So how to analyze sort of the state of democracy in Mali? Many of us right now are waiting, for the next round of elections, but this also affords an opportunity where I think many of my colleagues are saying it's important to take stock of where we are, what multi-partyism's been able to achieve, but also where some of the deficiencies within democracy in the Malian state. And so my colleague Igor Logvanenko and I use the term uneven pluralism to describe the state of democratic practice in Mali, where we have regularized elections, we have pretty good freedom of the press, freedom of association. And if you look at public opinion data coming from Afrobarometer, you see consistent support from Malians for multi-party elections and multi-partyism. But you see very poor rule of law, weak checks on executive power, and very weak linkages between civil society and political parties. So these deficiencies are coupled with an overall problem of state weakness, where the state has a lot of difficulty projecting power into the periphery. As I noted, we've seen a proliferation of insurgent groups, self-defense groups, and this is in the context of dramatic or substantial international intervention, where you have about 5,000 troops and 14,000 UN troops in the Sahel region. But again, if you talk to people in the center of the north, they would describe their situation as extremely insecure and feeling rather unprotected by the state. So while there's been a pervasive sort of problem of corruption and misgovernance dating back to the period before 2012, this crisis has really sort of weakened the Malian state and also affected citizens' perceptions of the state as they have seen themselves left vulnerable in sort of a period of heightened crisis. So this creates really new, difficult policy challenges moving forward. So again, just to underscore sort of what Malian democracy has not yet been able to achieve to this point. Again, a problem with linkages between parties and civil society, this inability to check the incumbent or the executive, an ability to generate or willingness to generate a strong, locally derived, inward-looking policy as the state interacts with the international community. Things like improving the quality of education, which is at the forefront of the minds of many young people. And Mali exhibits one of the highest gender gaps in sub-Saharan Africa, both in terms of political knowledge and political participation. And finally, in terms of state capacity, there's still this massive problem with corruption and a question about how do you create a more efficient and responsive bureaucracy? How do you create a stronger and more capable military? Because from 2012 to present, there's been very limited progress in spite of the international intervention in Mali. So I want to pivot now and use the rest of my presentation to speak very briefly about the role of religion in politics in Mali. In many ways, it's a good example of civil society and the way civil society operates. So there are no religious parties in Mali, but you have a very strong group of clerics. So religious leaders have backed presidential candidates in the past. They've mobilized their followers in protests, and especially the three leaders on the right of the screen have tremendous political power. So you've seen an increasing role of jihadists in governance as an explicit challenge to the state. And what I want to underscore here is that really, that's a big shift from the historical relationship between Islamic networks of service provision that work in tandem or side by side with the state. Religious leaders in the past, or even till present, play a role in sort of checking the president. So using protests and lobbying to achieve policy goals. And as I'll describe in a few slides, a lot of the focus groups, a lot of people would describe them as a fourth branch of government. So essentially, if no one else is willing to hold the executive accountable, that's when religious leaders within civil society step in as the voice of the people. And so this is really the historic pattern of challenge and accommodation where religious leaders habitate a space very close to politics, but somehow manage to stay outside of the political fray as not to get their hands too dirty. So just in closing, for the last couple minutes, I wanted to talk about some of this focus group data that I collected in Mali in 2015 with a team of research assistants. We were talking to young people in tea drinking groups, locally called Grain. And we had a module on a bunch of different questions, but I'm going to focus now on some of the responses related to the question. We essentially asked young people, what should the role of religion be in politics? We know that religious and traditional elites are extremely respected. I think Mali ranks just only behind Senegal and Afrobarometer scales in terms of how religious or how traditional leaders rank. So trying to understand what role should the religious elite play in Malian democracy today. And so I'll stress that these surveys are conducted in 2 urban areas, the capital of Bamako, but also Sévaré, which is very much right in the heart of the current crisis in terms of insecurity and the presence of insurgent and jihadist groups. The focus groups, there are about almost 70 of them with around 330 active respondents. Many more people were participating because we were essentially going and sitting in with consent and permissions on these tea drinking groups that meet regularly and posing questions to this organic focus group on their ideas and opinions. And so the transcripts were recorded in predominantly in Bambara, a local language, and then translated from French, from Bambara to French. And so I wanted to highlight, 4 key themes that come out of those discussions. So 4 trends that we see. So first is religious leaders as a moralizing check on government. So That is to say, when the government's will steps out of line with that of the people, stepping in to make sure that the government is held accountable. Also, and relatedly, as counselors to political leaders so that they're able to champion Malian values. And what's interesting here is in many of the responses, we see more of sort of this populist rhetoric of the will of the people rather than an explicit sort of religious messaging from these leaders. And interesting also, the two recent juntas in 2012 and 2020 have also used a language of stepping in for the will of the people, checking the executive when the other branches don't. So I think there are interesting parallels there. So third is these religious leaders can give the state legitimacy. So because they're seen as having more credibility, legitimacy, and honesty, they can step in and mobilize and sensitize populations in conjunction with the government. So we see the government relying on these services quite frequently. And then lastly, there's a real emphasis, Mali has a tremendous culture of religious tolerance and interaction and cooperation between Christians and Muslims of different varieties. And so there's a real stress on the primary role of religious leaders to be creating social cohesion and to repair social tissue rather than any kind of divisive behavior that would fragment people. Again, this is from the perspective of our young respondents. And so just, I wanted to highlight two quotes that speak to the first two sort of roles of religious leaders as both counselors, but also this fourth branch of government, or a check on the political elite. And you can see here the juxtaposition of corruption within government services and then religion having the ability to moralize or oversee corruption. And this is not unlike rhetoric we've seen in other regions. I'm thinking of, for instance, Tom Popinski's work, where we see religious parties as more capable of tackling an issue like corruption. Again, this is the case where we're just talking about religious leaders. So I'll give you a little bit more time to scroll through this. But again, this emphasis on dirty, lying sort of politics, and then clean moral religion. Next, this quote I thought gave us a sense of religious leaders as the voice of the people, the will of the people. So requiring them to speak up and counsel politicians in order to prevent them from overreach, but also from deviating from the path that the general population would want. And just quickly to say that if we jump into the world of electoral politics, there's much more debate and disagreement about whether or not there should be Islamic political parties, whether or not candidates or religious clerics or imams should run. So I just, without getting into details here, wanted to highlight that unlike the four themes that I just highlighted, this was something that was much more contentious. So in closing, Mali continues to be characterized by state weakness, right? And this regularization of multi-party elections has allowed really a growth of civil society, a growth of real freedom of association and communication, but it has not yet improved some really important aspects of democracy, including rule of law and party strength. So I've highlighted some, I think, critical policy questions as we move forward, especially in this 18-month interim period where we think about the lead up to multi-party elections. And so I think I'm at time, so I will step out and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bleck, for an excellent presentation to kick off the panel. The theme on religious leaders as a moralizing check on the political elite and governance and of state bureaucracy is a very interesting one, and can see, how that has changed historically, as you've gestured in your discussion. I think that will be a central theme, probably will come up as a central theme in our panel today. We'll already have a few questions coming in. So now let's turn to Professor Mark Tessler for his presentation on the Middle East. Hi, Mark. You're muted. Could you? Could you unmute yourself?
There we are. It took me a minute to find it, but we're all set. So I join my fellow panelists in thanking the Weiser Center for putting this together and for inviting me to be part of it. I'm going to be talking about the Arab world. This is a good segue from the presentation on Mali, because I'll also be talking about the attitudes and values of ordinary citizens, and I'll also be taking a look at where religion fits into the situation. I just listed here a couple of reasons why it's really important to include ordinary citizens in thinking about democracy. And I put the word transition rather than, I almost was going to cross out survival, but I decided to leave it. There's really only one country in the Arab world that can be considered a democracy, and it's pretty fragile. There are several others, 3 or 4 others, that are fairly open and deserve to be mentioned. But the dominant theme is authoritarianism. Several different brands of authoritarianism, but definitely not democracy. So for these countries to transition to democracy, what's important so far as ordinary citizens are concerned, well, is that they support the principles of democracy. They have an institutional commitment to democracy. This may have problems, but it's still the best form of government. Democratic values, tolerance, civic engagement, social capital, equality, interpersonal trust, which I'll be talking about. So it's important to include ordinary citizens, as the Mali presentation did, in discussions of where we are and where we might be. I'll be using Arab barometer data. So I won't spend a lot of time on the methods here. Let me just say that we've done this for 15 years, over 5 waves, and the data are available to those who would like to have them at no charge, of course. You can go onto our website and download the data. And if you have physical packages, you can do whatever you want with them. They're yours they're in the public domain. But you can also do a lot of analysis online. So if you were to look, check out the online analysis tool, and you'll see that you can go pretty deep into figuring out who said what at one country and what time period, and whether that's the same for men and women, things like that. So there's a very powerful online data analysis tool, and I encourage people to take a look. There's also a lot of additional information that I won't try to summarize here. Just how is the barometer administered, paid for, who are we working with, what's the methodology, what are quality control procedures, what are some of the main things we found, and I'll select a few of them for discussion now. So first, this notion of institutional commitment, going back to the to things that are important with respect to ordinary citizens. We've had 5 waves, and I've only used the last 4 waves because this starts in 2011, after the Arab Spring, and we can carry the analysis forward. Let's see if I can get this on slideshow so it'll be a little bit bigger. Yeah, there's some things down at the bottom I can't really get rid of. So we can see that here's a summary for each country. In general, there's been a fair amount of continuity between over the 4 waves since 2011. Excuse me. Sorry. And there's some differences. There's some countries like that have declined from a high, like maybe Iraq could start off in 2011 really pretty optimistic, and it's still fairly high. We can't say these people do not support democracy, but the proportion that do is fewer. Some are consistent at a very high level. This is Lebanon, and some are increasing, not tremendously, but there is declining, and that would be Palestine. So this gives us a picture of what people think about democracy as a political system. And on the basis of which we know that support for the idea of democracy, for its institutions, for its procedures, is important as well. Of course, what leaders do is very important. There are critical institutions, military, civil society, but just the views of ordinary citizens, I think, are quite important as well. And so I want to give you a feel for how that looks across the number of countries in the Arab world, and how it has or has not changed over these 4 time periods since 2011 up to 2018, the last one. I'd be happy to have questions about any of these slides. I'm just going to go through them briefly. I don't think it'll take me 15 minutes. And naturally, I'm having some problems here. Okay, this is the next one. I think this is a very important concept. It's interpersonal trust. Sorry. And it was, all right. There's okay, maybe I'm going to give up on, here we go. Okay. So as I said before, there's a kind of syndrome of values and orientations that we know from a lot of research are really very important for the success of democracy, for it to survive, for it to be consolidated, for it to be sustainable after that, and even to some extent in the early stages, maybe a little bit less important in the early stages of a democratic transition. And so there is this network of views that are important. Like many others, I've done some research on this. These are just some quick descriptive findings to kind of give you a sense of one thing among others that's very important, and kind of how it looks across the region. I think that all these values and orientations are important. I particularly emphasize interpersonal trust, which is why I chose this question. If you really don't trust people like yourselves, other ordinary citizens, to be responsible, to be honest, to have the best interest of the country at heart, as opposed to being very selfish and duplicitous, if that's the case, well, you're probably not going to like democracy very much, because democracy gives voice and a measure of power and influence to these people, to the people that are like you. On the other hand, if you do trust people, then sure, they should count. They should play an important role in political life and in ensuring the survival and effective working of democracy. We see a number of different patterns here, and I've just summarized them a little bit. One thing that's very interesting is what I call this Arab Spring boost in Egypt and Tunisia. In 2011, both in Egypt and a little bit less, but still quite prominently in Tunisia, there's a lot of interpersonal trust. This comes right after the Arab Spring. In both Egypt and Tunisia, the old regime, Mubarak in Egypt and Ben Ali in Tunisia, had been deposed, and the countries are beginning on a very hopeful transition. Tunisia's has continued with some ups and downs and some concerns, but nonetheless has continued. Egypt's continued for a little bit, but ended up with an army takeover, what most people would call a coup, and pretty authoritarian systems since then. But we can see how, in response to events, I don't know, I did this in advance. I don't know why I'm having so many problems, but we'll get it in a minute. Sorry. And now I want to go into the next one. Okay, so here we are. And so we can see that in general, it's pretty low. It's pretty low across the region, despite these spikes, and one or two other instances in which it's pretty high. And we can take a look at those countries and try to figure out what was going on at the time that might account for this. But in general, it's very low. It's up and down in some countries, but it remains at a pretty low level in the 20s, often less than the 20s. Look at Lebanon, 17% at the beginning, gone down significantly since then. And if you've been following events in Lebanon, you could maybe make some educated guesses about why that's the case. But I think this is really a problem for the region. And I think, there's a need for the leaders of these countries to pay attention to these things if they have any aspirations for democracy. So this represents one important element of a battery of attitudes and values that really make a difference. And we can see that in this respect, the countries in general are pretty deficient. And that contrasts with the previous slide, where there was high support for democracy. People want democracy as they understand it. There's a whole separate dimension of things to talk about in terms of what their understanding is. But while they want democracy, some of the foundations that should exist among these people who want democracy, trusting of other people like themselves, are missing. Here's something on Islam. So people like democracy in general. Some like it very much, some like it a little bit less, but their attitudes are all at the minimum in the mid to high 70%. So what kind of democracy do they want? And we've taken a look at how they think about the role of Islam, and we've interacted that with their support for democracy. So here's a question about democracy. Democracy, whatever its limits, is better than other political systems. This is an Afrobarometer item as well. It comes from the World Values Survey originally. And so we've dichotomized those who do and those who do not agree or strongly agree that democracy is, whatever its limitations, is the best political system. And then we've taken a question about religion, about Islam and political Islam. There are a lot of questions, and I picked this one because it correlates very highly with the others, and it's a good representative of this battery of items about political Islam. And here are the percentages across the different countries, and they're given in more detail down at the bottom. In general, despite some variation from country to country, we can see that support is primarily for secular democracy with the view that men of religion should not influence government decisions. But there's about between a quarter and a third of the people who support democracy who strongly agree with this proposition about democracy, that no, Islam should play an important role. So we see overwhelming support for democracy, about a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio of people who support secular democracy, as I'm calling it, as opposed to democracy with Islam. If you want to see how that varies or what that looks like among individual countries, they're down here at the bottom. You can see it. And these categories are interesting. They're a bit of a digression, but what do people have in mind when they say they don't like democracy and they don't want Islam to be involved in politics? This is probably support for an old Nasserist ideology, a kind of secular authoritarian regime. And this one too, so we won't take time to talk about them, but there is a minority, roughly in the area of 15 or 20%, taking these two categories together, of people who don't want democracy and don't want Islam. That's certainly a very small minority, but it would be interesting to take a look at that as well. And as I said, here are the scores for individual countries, Algeria, Jordan, and so forth, down at the bottom. We can come back and talk about any one of these if you would like. My usual problem at this point. I don't know why. All right. Okay. So here's the last slide. So we'll finish up on time, I think. So we also asked people, do you think democracy is the best system for you? Is it appropriate for your country? Is your country ready for democracy? So there's a series of questions like that, They're answered on a 10-point scale ranging from 1 to 10. And I've taken the top 3, 8, 9, and 10 as indicating, yes, I think it's quite appropriate. Maybe not very appropriate up there at 9 or 10, but quite appropriate. And we can see that in general, the patterns are the pattern is of low agreement with that proposition. There are a few instances in countries where it shoots up. Never really very much, about 50%. Here's 61%, 48%, 55%. But usually it's down here in the 20s. In a few cases, a little bit less. A few cases, a little bit more. But there's also a contradiction here. I think this has implications for what's going on in the region. People want democracy very, very overwhelmingly, as we saw in the first slide. Their values or their trust in fellow citizens isn't really entirely where it should be in terms of making democracy work. And now, maybe for that reason, they really have doubts about whether democracy is the right system for their country. There are some interesting ups and downs in countries. This wave in Egypt is really interesting. This is right after the Arab Spring. This is after the first coup of the Islamic government that came to power at that time. So we can take a look at what's going on in individual countries and speculate about what's driving this up and down over time, over this 10-year period, or this actually 7 or 8 year period. But we can see again that that we don't have either the strong institutional commitment or the strong normative values, democratic values, that are really important for democracy. And so above and beyond whatever we might look to and hope for from leaders, we have to pay attention to ordinary citizens as well. So that's the presentation. I apologize for the complications along the way. And I'm going to.
Thank you so much, Professor Tessler, for that survey of the Middle East region. There is a lot there in terms of temporal variation within individual countries, but also across countries that we could possibly parse through our Q&A and later discussion. And up next, let me invite our Professor Yardımcı, calling in from Istanbul, for her presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Hanisah. Let me share my screen first. Okay. Okay, I guess you can see my screen, yeah? Okay, thank you very much for the invitation as well. It's great that you finally realize this after so long time. It's good that you can make it. So I will be talking. So I was muted.
Hi, Şebnem. There seems to be an audio problem with your mic.
Is it better now?
Yeah, so much better now.
Okay, great. So I will be talking about democratic breakdown in Turkey. So while we have been discussing democratic survival, the case of Turkey is a little bit depressing in comparison to other ones. And I will provide a brief account discussing like what is the current situation at the moment, what explains the rise of competitive authoritarianism in the country, and finally I will try to provide some prospects of the a discussion on the prospects of the current regime. So as you know, like in discussing the democratic survival in the Muslim world, it has been unfortunate that it almost become an imperative to refer to the case of Turkey, as it is today a paradigmatic case of democratic decline. Let me show you some graphs to demonstrate the extent of the problem in the country. And like for many scholars, the country is defined as a competitive authoritarian regime at the moment. So for instance, as can be seen from these figures, from 2010 onwards, Turkey has experienced a sharp decline in all major democracy indices, such as on electoral democracy index, civil liberties index, freedom of expression, and for several democracy indexes, Turkey is not a democracy anymore. And this graph on institutionalized democracy shows that democratic backsliding in the country has culminated into a democratic breakdown from 2016 onwards. And as such, for many observers today, Turkey is a competitive authoritarian regime in which elections do exist, but the playing field is uneven and political rights and civil liberties are on hold. So although the decline of democracy in the country could be considered part of a larger global trend, it has been much more dramatic in comparison to several other examples, such as Hungary, Philippines, Thailand, or Poland. So from this perspective, we can suggest that the decline in the country and the democratic breakdown later on has been much more severe in comparison to other cases. So let me give a picture of Turkey today and how we came to the current situation. All this has been experienced under the Justice and Development Party rule, which is a party that is considered to be the splinter party of Islamist political movements. Coming to power in 2002, the government initially aspired the role of democratizing Turkey, in that the party passed several liberalizing reforms, decreasing the role of military and increasing the civil rights and liberties. And all had been done in line with the EU acquis communautaire, because the country was a candidate country back then, and receive the date afterwards. So what we see is that like the party in the beginning was a major force of democratization. But however, like what we see is that these reforms mostly remained on paper, and as the government has increased its power through several election victories, so in 2007, in 2011, 2015, twin elections, 2018, the government has started to focus more on capturing the state rather than continuing these democratizing reforms. So as such, using referendums as a medium, the AKP headed by Erdogan not only centralized power at the hands of popularly elected president, but also guaranteed its control over independent institutions. And concurrently, frequent harassment of independent media, restrictions on freedom of political association and speech, and suppression of opposition figures or other government critics have become ordinary features of politics in Turkey, unfortunately. And in addition to that, as mentioned before, the fairness of the elections has also become questionable, with the AKP controlling all state resources as well as the media outlets. And at the same time, the opposition forces mainly lacked sufficient means to compete with the incumbent on equal basis. And the best expression of democratic decline and later on democratic breakdown in the country has been the change of the political regime from parliamentarism to presidential system, let's say presidential system a la Turca in April 2017. And this happened through a referendum. Why a la Turca? Because Turkish presidentialism is with weak checks and balances and is distinguished among its kind by the prominence of executive at the expense of legislative. So in which the power is mostly centralized at the hands of the president only. And this is a very quick summary of what kind of a regime now there is in Turkey. And we call this a complete authoritarian regime ruled under a presidential system in which the president enjoys extensive powers over all other institutions. But here this is actually the second part of the presentation. So what explains the rise of competitive authoritarianism in Turkey? Because this is also a key question in the literature on democracy and autocracy as well. So why a country which has experience with democracy for more than 60 years has actually experienced this democratic breakdown? And when we have a look at the literature, what we see is that the literature mostly focuses on defining the regime type and discusses how the country has shifted from electoral democracy into a competitive authoritarian regime. So it has never become a consolidated democracy anyway, but it had, like, the elections were free and fair for the most part of the democratic history, but now it shifted to competitive authoritarianism. And the literature mostly deals with like how this happened and what kind of a regime is there in Turkey. A few studies has accounted for why. So for instance, like some suggested that the shifting balance of power in Turkish politics in favor of the AKP, the party's ideology and social culture cleavages are underlined as reasons, while others highlight the ineffectiveness of social opposition, external anchors in the form of the EU, and the lack of external anchors, and the AKP's overconfidence on popular support. For some scholars, it is the Kemalist establishment's oversight on politics that created existential insecurity for the AKP, and in that sense, like, forced the party to conquer the state in order to survive. Others underlined the clientelistic ties to businessmen and urban poor as the major factor behind the maintenance of the regime, but these has mostly explained the mechanism without really discussing why it has become a complex authoritarian regime. And most recently, Esen and Gümüşçü provides a political economy account, arguing that the coalitional ties that the AKP forged with the businesses and the urban pool through the distribution of public resources has altered the cost of toleration for the party leadership. and their dependent clients, while reducing the cost of suppression for incumbents, which in turn led to the emergence of competitive authoritarian regime. So although like most of these explanations have some explanatory power, as a party politics scholar, I will provide an alternative view, a party politics account of why Turkey has become a competitive authoritarian regime after such a long experience of democracy. So I contend that like unstable party system stands as a missing link that explains how state shaping from above, which has been there for many years, exclusionary constitutional making processes, and deep-seated social cultural divides have finally produced a competitive authoritarian regime. So here the institutionalization of a party system is defined as having two conditions. First, the principles, norms, and codes of political competition should prevail for a long period of time and shall be accepted by the political parties for the stability and legitimacy of the rules of the game, which is named as political entrenchment. And secondly, all political parties in the system all political parties in the system should recognize one another as legitimate agents, so inter-party trust. So let me be a little bit faster because I'm out of time. So what we see is that both are missing in Turkey. So there is unstable party system, which refers to lack of agreement on the rules of the game, which is problematic for party regime interaction, and the lack of inter-party trust, which is problematic for inter-party interactions. Why this happens? So like a comparative historical analysis would suggest that like looks at the background of the democratic history and suggesting that state shaping from above, so constitutions made by the military, there had been reserved domains of power, exclusionary constitution making related to the first one, and deep-seated social cultural divides. And the impact of these on party system has been conflictual encounters at the elite level, no elite consensual unity over the political regime, and the conceiving politics as a zero-sum game. So this created a political system in which the defeat of the opposition is considered to be above everything else, including the democratic practices. And this in turn encouraged party elites to seek alliances outside the accountable domain. And like as the literature already suggests, that the stability and long-term prospects for survival of democratic regimes highly depend on the broad elite consensual unity. And this has been lacking in Turkey from the very beginning of transition to democracy. But why after the 2010s is also important to respond. And here we can refer to the 2001 economic crisis as creating a perfect storm, actually like leading to a party system collapse and leaving only AKP and Republican People's Party as two parties managed to enter the parliament. But this has been accompanied by the rise of populism and a strong leader. What are the prospects of the current regime? So a look into strengths and weakness can give us some idea about it. Currently, the major strengths of this regime is the Erdogan himself. He still enjoys a high popular support, and although some alternative names started to emerge, he seems to be alone, stand alone in his crown. So Erdogan is even now the most popular leader in the country. Secondly, after 28 years of rule, all institutions are controlled by Erdogan and his close circle, including the army. And finally, clientelistic links to businessmen and urban poor, as argued by Sani Gümüşçü, creates a vicious circle. And as long as these groups ties their survival to the face of political regime, they continue to support the Erdogan's rule. But besides these strengths, there are also several weaknesses of the current regime. First and foremost, the party machine experiences an organizational decay, and we call this the institutionalization of the AKP, which has been just published by Party Politics. I would be happy to share. The fragile political regime. So like this is after the introduction of presidentialism, Erdogan's and his close circles dominance has become much more visible, creating a one-man rule. And with great powers comes great responsibility. So now the political and economic failures of the regime is directly linked to Erdogan and his close circle. Thirdly, after several years of AKP domination, now opposition is much more capable of coordinating. And we have seen in the recent local elections, in the presidential elections, and there have been several other examples. And finally, we can see that like currently there is also elite defection. Several major figures from the party now establish their own political parties. And let me finish here. So overall, what we see is that opposition is much more competent today in their fight for democracy. The AKP lost control of most of the major cities, which is a major source of financial power. And we can suggest that like Turkey being hit by the pandemic significantly, and so both political and economic crises are here, the ability of the AKP to overcome this crisis is much lower than before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yardımcı. I think Turkey remains one of the most important cases in the Muslim world for a very long-standing democratic regime to be witnessing democratic backsliding and increasing centralization of power in the figure of the president is something that is completely concerning, and you've, in your presentation have shown us as much. And it's probably apt that you ended with elite defections as one of the central problems in Turkey, and why not move to Professor Rahim now, who will speak on Southeast Asia cases and what's happening in Malaysia and Indonesia. Professor Rahim, please. Can you unmute?
Yes. Yes. Okay. Good evening, or it is evening in Australia, Sydney. Thank you, Dr. Hanisah, for hosting this webinar. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the WCED Center for Emerging Democracies for inviting me to participate in this webinar. My presentation this evening will be low tech. So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. Essentially what I want to do is to examine the key factors and forces that contributed to the collapse of the reformist Pakatan National Government after being in government for only 22 months. It was elected in May 2018. Now, so I want to focus on that, and there are a range of factors which contributed to this government collapsing, despite its ability to defeat a government, a coalition government, the Barisan National Government of Malaysia, that had been in power for more than 6 decades. And this success of the Pakatan Harapan coalition in defeating a government that had been in power for such a long period of time has been referred to as a classic breakthrough election. Now, there was widespread jubilation when this then opposition coalition managed to defeat the incumbent. And even 100 days after its victory, the Pakatan Harapan coalition received very impressive approval ratings. Various polls showed that after 100 days, support was anywhere from about 70 to 80%. However, a year later, by early 2019, initial public elation with the Pakatan Harapan government had clearly dissipated. So what happened? Now, this government was ousted by what many refer to as a soft coup, instigated by opposition politicians acting with Pakatan politicians, some disgruntled Pakatan politicians. And so what we have today, after the soft coup, is a return to basically the old forms of, shall we say, electoral authoritarian governance. And associated with that, in the Malaysian context, a return to ethno and Islamist nationalism, which, you know, define or characterize the Barisan Nasional government. Now, let's look at the public opinion polls. As I noted earlier, the Pakatan Harapan government received strong support, 70 to 80%, and then that sharp drop. The Ilham Center and Penang Institute survey conducted just a few months before the coup in October and December 2018 found that 60% of Malays who are the dominant indigenous or Bumiputra community in Malaysia were unhappy with the reformist Pakatan Harapan government. Now, this finding, and this is significant because Malays and other Bumiputras make up more than 60% of the population. Now, this finding was reaffirmed by another poll, and that is the Emir Research poll, which was done only a month before the soft coup in late February 2020. And this Emir Research poll showed that only 29% of Malays believed that they were better off under the Pakatan Harapan government. But what's interesting about this survey, these two surveys, is that it's not only the Malay community, the numerically dominant Malay community, Malay Muslim community that was unhappy with this reformist government, but also ethnic minorities such as the Chinese community, who make up more than 20% of the population, but are disproportionately represented in the business sector and also in the middle classes. Both communities, Malays, felt as though this government was selling them out. Similarly, the Chinese also felt that this government was selling them out. And this gives you some idea of, you know, what happened in late February 2020 that contributed to the coup. Now, when this government was elected on a strongly reformist platform, after 60 years of a government that was perceived to be increasingly corrupt, and many of you would have heard of the 1MDB corruption scandal amounting to billions of dollars. So this government promised a slew of reforms within 100 days. In actuality, 2/3 of these promises were not followed through. However, some key reforms were initiated, such as the abolition of the unpopular GST, or goods and services tax, that legal proceedings on the corruption scandal, which implicated former Prime Minister Najib Razak, would proceed, and it occurred. months after the new government got in, and cancellation and renegotiation of billion-dollar contracts, which many believed were tainted by corruption. Now, I won't go through the whole list of reforms, you know, and reforms that didn't happen and why they didn't happen. But so I'll just list the significant ones. A substantive reform occurred in the judicial arena, judicial reforms. For example, the appointment of a prominent human rights barrister, Tommy Thomas, as the Attorney General for the country. This is unprecedented. Never before did Malaysia have a non-Malay Muslim Attorney General. And this obviously pleased many who supported this reformist government. In addition to that, we have this reformist government appointing non-Malay and non-Muslims as Chief Justice of the country. An East Malaysian Christian was appointed Chief Justice, and then later when he retired, a woman, a Muslim woman, was appointed Chief Justice of the country. And this is all unprecedented. And in the eyes of many Democrats, this was perceived as progressive indeed. However, it displeased many conservative ethno-nationalists and conservative Islamists, these appointments. Now, another controversial initiative which was perceived as progressive by Democrats, but opposed by the more conservative elements in Malaysia's society, was the appointment of the leader of the Democratic Action Party, Lim Guan Eng, as finance minister. Here again, this is unprecedented. There was some precedent in the 60s and 70s, but for many decades, this position was held by a Malay Muslim. So for the first time in a long time, this position was held by a Chinese. Now, as I noted earlier, many Muslims thought that this was quite outrageous, that this very pivotal, important position should be held by a non-Muslim. And I'll be talking a little bit more about Salafi Islamist notions of governance, whereby senior leadership positions in government should not be held by non-Muslims. And also it violated ethno-nationalist conceptions of Ketuanan Melayu or Malay dominance, particularly within the realms of government. Another interesting appointment, unprecedented, was that of the appointment of one Aziza, one Ismail, as the Deputy Prime Minister of the country. Here again, many, were overjoyed, but others were unhappy, thinking, particularly Salafi Islamists who believe that women should not hold very senior positions in government. Now, one of the reasons why the Pakatan Harapan reformist government was elected to office was because of the multi-billion-dollar 1MDB corruption scandal. So it promised that if elected and when elected, it would introduce wide-ranging anti-corruption reforms. And this is exactly what it did. For example, a Governance Integrity Anti-Corruption Center was established. A national anti-corruption plan was also implemented, with the ambitious plan of Malaysia being a corruption-free country by 2020. the head of the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission was Latifa Koifa, a human rights lawyer with a reputation for being fiercely independent and with considerable integrity. And the list goes on. So this is where the government delivered on its promises. The establishment of an independent police complaints misconduct commission to promote external oversight of the police force that many believed was corrupt during the BN rule. And then there were also a range of reforms in the pipeline. So these were not implemented because of the soft coup which ousted this reformist government. Now, so this government was elected on a reform agenda platform. And this platform, this reform agenda, was often referred to as the promotion of a new Malaysia or Malaysia Baru. Now, there's been quite a bit of literature on this period, this tumultuous period, which suggests that this reform agenda was sabotaged, arguably by elements from within the bureaucracy. And this explains why, one of the reasons why the implementation of many of these reforms was stymied. And there's been some evidence to suggest that resistance from within the bureaucracy and resistance from within opposition forces had demoralized many senior politicians within the Pakatan Harapan government, particularly after this government, only being 22 months in office, suffered from a series of by-election losses, one after another. And so the argument is that they became less committed towards following through with their reform agenda.
Hi, Lily.
Yes.
Can you wrap up in about a minute?
Also, yes. Okay. All right, I'll try and do the impossible. But one area that this government showed that it was not particularly reformist was in the area of ethnic-based affirmative action, policies and programs. If anything else, this government continued many of the ethnic-based affirmative action policies of the former ethno-Islamist government. So this is the key paradox of the new Malaysian agenda, which contributed to its final ousting. It did not please Muslims, nor did it please non-Muslims. I argue in my paper that one of the key fault line of this reformist government is that it failed to come up with a comprehensive narrative, a reformist narrative, which would have gone some way towards supporting its reformist agenda. And this narrative could have included a reformist interpretation of Islam to counter Salafi Islam that had been entrenched within the country. My last point before I end, Hanisah, is that this government also collapsed because of intra and inter-party tensions within this coalition government. Basically, this coalition was cobbled together only months just a few months before the May 2018 elections. So in other words, in ideological, philosophical, theological, political terms, there was not much coherence between the various component parties in this government. And hence, you know, tensions bubbled up and surfaced, and eventually some elements colluded with the opposition parties, leading to the coup. So a range of factors, resistance from within the state, resistance from the opposition parties, and also resistance from within the Pakatan coalition parties who were not fully committed towards the reformist agenda. So we have today a government in Malaysia, a coalition government, which has not been elected by the people, and therefore its mandate is not at all strong. Elections are likely to occur within the next 12 months. It's unclear what would happen, what is going to happen. The political situation in Malaysia is extremely fluid at the moment. So Malaysia is a classic case of unstable democratization, a country that had transitioned or moved towards democratization and then moved backwards, severe backsliding because of all these fault lines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lily Rahim, for that fantastic presentation. And I thought what was very interesting was when you mentioned even during the 22 months, there was democratic reform, but it was uneven, right? And it ties very nicely back to Jaimie's first presentation of pockets of uneven democratization in the case of Mali. And so without further ado, let me now move on to moderate the questions and question and answer. What I will do is there are several overlapping questions. And so what I will do is try to group some of those questions and we could address them together. So for the first set of questions, this is for Jaimie. Can you say more about, okay, so this group of questions pertains to the role of religious leaders in Mali and Mali's political landscape. So can you say more about why the shift in the role of religious leaders occurred, as you had discussed historically? And also another, a related question to this is, could you explain a bit more as to why Mali does not have political parties? And I think he means religious political parties. It sounds interesting that Islamism has not made inroads in a country which has a historically weak state. So maybe we can kick off with those two sets of questions.
Sure, thank you. Those are great questions. I guess I want to preface by saying that to underscore the diversity of religious leaders and clerics within Mali. So my presentation towards the end was mostly focused on these three prominent clerics who project a lot of power from the capital in Bamako and their strategies. And so looking at the way that they've interacted with the political system from the multi-party era to present, through a series of sort of protests and lobbying mobilization that has very effectively helped them to achieve some policy goals. And so I guess in part answering that second question about religious parties, I think that for them, to date, these have been fairly effective mechanisms for getting their agendas and projecting their own political power, and haven't necessarily required consolidation into parties and then the hard work of governing. As I alluded to in my presentation, electoral politics and secular politics is still sort of tainted, or at least there's an awareness that it's born out of a colonial system of governance, right, that Mali inherited. And so oftentimes religious leaders can use this rhetoric of a clean, sort of pure Islam that is married to Malian values versus a system that is imposed. And this is particularly the case for partisanship. And so Mali, as I mentioned, has a strong history of consensual democratic practices dating back centuries, where this is very much people sitting around and talking and deliberating until a consensus is reached, not unlike the systems described in Senegal by Frederick Schaeffer and Gellner and others, And so this idea of consensus is really different than partisanship, where you're accepting sort of division and competition. And so I think that that culture of consensus over sort of partisanship has both created incentives for religious leaders, the sort of top religious leaders, to work within the system to get their agendas across, rather than starting their own party and loading that with expectations of what they might do. But that is just speculation. The second question is about the shift. I assume that the shift that the question refers to is the sort of jihadist shift vis-a-vis how religious leaders had traditionally worked with the population. And so this is a question of core and periphery. And so the group that I haven't talked about at all would be sort of the decentralized networks of clerics and religious leaders across the country, who are sort of like chiefs, living the day-to-day with people in their communities, and are absolutely sort of critical for helping with conflict resolution, and for a slew of other activities in the realm of governance. I think the open question, I haven't looked extensively into this. One of my co-authors, Alex Thurston, has some work on this, but the question of how their role is shifting over time, I think that's a big question mark. So I'm, again, predominantly comparing the clerics in Bamako and centralized, or sort of that have the most power, and then contrasting that to jihadist movements who have gone from an emphasis on controlling capital cities early on to now a very localized, decentralized sort of form of governance and service provision that explicitly delegitimizes and excludes the presence of the state. And so how and why that happened, that's a million other question, but definitely, I mean, it's linked going back to the origins of the crisis in 2012 and sort of the destabilization that happened there, and the governance vacuum that opened up space for groups that had been making inroads since the late 90s, early thousands, to really take on more power as they continued sort of to grow in the absence of the state. But yeah, I could go on for a long time, but I'll cut myself off there for now.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions from Mark. So the first question, to what extent would the public's display of key normative values, such as interpersonal trust, be important in influencing democratic breakdown or renewal? Or is it simply an indicator after the fact? And the second question, I think, is a much broader question, which I would invite all of our panelists to speculate on within, the study of their own regions. This question specifically for Mark: could you also speculate on the chances for democratic survival in Tunisia? And maybe we can go around for other panelists to think about the same questions with in relation to Mali, Turkey, and Malaysia, and broader Southeast Asia. Mark?
Okay, well, thank you very much. With respect to trust, I think the question that was asked was, is it really important at the early stages, as opposed to something that has this explanatory power after the fact? I'd say it's a little of both, to the extent that it is important for sustaining democracy. And I'll say something about that when I get to Tunisia in a second. But it predisposes a kind of a deference to authority. I mean, if you feel that people like yourselves, ordinary citizens, can't be trusted to do anything more than advance their own personal interests, then who's going to provide leadership? Well, it's going to be the others. It's going to be the elites or the country's leaders. And so I think it's really important in that respect. And looking a little bit more deeply into the data, there's some interesting things that merit more discussion. I'll just mention them, and then I won't try to discuss them now. A fair proportion of the people who say they support democracy and who say they believe that democracy, despite all of its problems, is better than any other system, fair percentage of those people also say, yes, I think this country needs a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with elections and parliament. So this seems really in contradiction, but I think they tell us something about the mindset of these people. They then tend to have lower levels of interpersonal trust, and also to believe that their country isn't ready for democracy. So I don't think it's so much an obstacle to having some sort of a democratic transition, like the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt and a few other places. It's what are the values of the people that are now given a more important role in governance. And we can see there are a lot of contradictions that are not necessarily uniformly in support of greater democratization. To some extent, they're prepared to defer to to authoritarian leaders, non-democratic leaders, even though they've said they value very democracy. So there's a lot more to unpack there, but we can see that as we dig a little deeper, what ordinary citizens think about democracy and other things makes a big difference. In terms of Tunisia, this is the one country in the Arab world that is considered to be a success and to have managed to maintain now for a decade its democratic transitions. It's very fragile. I think part of the reason it's been successful is that both the Islamists, and they're very strong there, they won. They did best in the election right after the Arab Spring, and the secularists who think that we have to that we have to find a way for Islamists and secularists, and they define themselves these ways, to live together. And so that's been an important part of the success of Tunisia. At the same time, I'll just try to list 3 or 4 things without taking up a lot of time. In both the secularist camp and the Islamist camp, there are, I'm not comfortable with the term extremes, but people who are unhappy with these kinds of compromises, that they've sold out too much to the other side. They're not protecting their core values enough. And so there's some tension in both of those camps. In addition, the governments that have come to power have been different from one another over the course of this last decade, but all of them have really failed to make a dent in corruption. They failed to really address the inequality of the major urban areas and the coastal elite, as opposed to the hinterland, where there are really serious inequalities in poverty problems. There are also some things that maybe Tunisia doesn't have direct control over, but that also raise questions. It's a country that sent more of its citizens to fight with the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq than any other Arab country. They have had a number of terrorist attacks. They've got terrible economic problems. So there's something really positive to say about Tunisia, and helps us to understand why it remains the best hope. But there are serious problems ahead, some of which it will be difficult for the government to deal with. But they have to find a way to do at least something. And then some things the government could do that it just hasn't been willing or able to do.
Thank you, Mark. Can I get Şebnem to weigh in on what you think is the prospect for democratic survival in Turkey?
Yeah, actually, as I mentioned in the final part of the presentation, currently now the government suffers from several weaknesses. So now we have much more competent opposition than before, and this has fruits of which has been observed in the recent local elections. The party has lost control of major cities such as Istanbul, Ankara, Antalya, Adana, and like considering that these are the major source of funding, major source of financial resources the party distributes to maintain this regime, this is quite a blow on the AKP's dominance. What else we can talk about, as I mentioned in the final part, the elite defection. These figures that I mentioned, such as Davutoğlu, he was former prime minister and now he has his own party. Former Minister of Finance, Ali Babacan, now he also has his own party. And these figures were the respected ones, and they have their own constituencies. So like current public opinion surveys maybe do not show that they have high support, but you never know. So like, because the scheduled elections are, there are still a lot of time for the scheduled elections, so 3 years. So from that perspective, I think the regime is much more fragile than before. And like added to that, like today, Turkey has hit by pandemic significantly. Which has been indicated by the higher number of unemployment, and also like currently it is in an economic crisis. The value of dollar is almost like $1 is 7.5 Turkish lira. So this has been the maybe the worst time the Turkish lira devalued. So from that perspective, like I can suggest that like the current regime is not as powerful as it was in 2 years ago. And like the opposition's ability, elite disunity, all these also indicate that, as supported by the literature, I would say we have a volatile regime, and the current government is not capable of overcoming these crises without becoming or without really increasing authoritarianism more and more. And that is on the one hand worrying, but on the other hand, there are, I would say, some promises for the democratic survival in the country.
Thank you, Şebnem. Can Lily quickly tell us what do you think is the outlook for Malaysia, and in looking forward to the next coming elections, whenever that may be? Will you see any changes in the constitution of the party politics? Any ideological reform changes, you think? Could you unmute?
This is very much a period of contingency, and it could go either way. I think what is important, and many of the speakers have mentioned this, the importance of strong state institutions that are autonomous and not captured by the various interest groups, business groups in society, state institutions that are effective as well, strong state institutions that are effective. And in the case of Southeast Asia, they only need to look at the Northeast Asian strong state, strong democratic states of South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. Those are possibly models for Malaysia, which has a tradition of developmentalism, state developmentalism. So that's, I think, an important ingredient. The other important ingredient, which I noted earlier, is the importance of Democrats, reformists, and others to construct a narrative, a democratic discourse and narrative to counter the more conservative, in the case of Malaysia, conservative, regressive, ethno-Islamist discourses, which have been promoted by more authoritarian political elites since the 1980s. And their discourse tends to be strongly Salafi in orientation. So it's not just Ketuanan Melayu or ethno-nationalism, but a strong dose of Salafism as well. So the importance of constructing a progressive Islamist discourse. And perhaps this is where they can look to countries like Tunisia for that, and possibly down south to countries like Indonesia, where we have quite progressive Islamist civil society organizations. Now, Malaysia's constitution is something that, post-colonial constitution that is something that needs to be reclaimed, because this is a constitution that enshrines many civil political liberties and promotes the notion of citizenship rights for all Malaysians, not just Malays and indigenous peoples of Malaysia, but all Malaysians. This is something that needs to be reclaimed and promoted. The other point, which is an interesting thing, which is happening in Malaysia at the moment, younger Malaysians, the youth in Malaysia, are galvanizing, fed up with all politics of these recycled elites that come and go, that move from both sides of the fence. And there's, too much meandering. So there is talk of a political party, a youth-based political party led by a dynamic politician. And this may be able to galvanize reformist Democrats and others to push the boundaries a bit more. This will probably be a multiracial political party led by youth, but also include older Malaysians. So the scenario in Malaysia actually leaves one somewhat optimistic about the future, because I believe that Malaysia does have the economic and political ingredients to consolidate gains made by the Pakatan Harapan government.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. Maybe we should just get Jaimie to give maybe 2 final sentences, and we will end with there. There are a bunch of other questions, but we couldn't get to them. In what's unfolding right now in Mali, what do you think? Could you weigh in on the democratic survival prospects in Mali?
Sure, I'm confident the population is going to continue to demand sort of democratic freedoms and norms of engagement and institutional reform. So I think there's going to continue to be that pressure from below, which makes me hopeful. I think that the issues related to state capacity definitely create a ceiling for democratic consolidation in terms of how far we think the democratic reach can actually, what it could achieve without simultaneous sort of investment in state capacity. And by state capacity, meaning both military capacity, but also the effectiveness of the bureaucracy.
Thank you so much again. And unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. And we have, taken 3 extra minutes anyway. I want to thank all of our panelists today. Thank you so much for coming in Istanbul, Australia, Ann Arbor, Notre Dame, Indiana. And I want to thank all of our audience for sticking with us in such a rousing discussion. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors for today's event, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, Global Islamic Studies, Digital Islamic Studies Center, and African Studies Center. Our next event is on October 4th, and that will be our Flashpoint series where we will discuss Lebanon. And if you're interested in any of our events, you can go to our website and click on the events button and find out more. So thank you again, panelists and our audience. Have a good day and good night wherever you may be. Thank you.
Thank you.